thing. Okay, so let's go through the skull. So you had some skulls. There's more skulls back there. You got some here. Take a skull. Here's some handouts. If you come in, here we go. These are the lists of the terms. So we'll look at the first column today. We do the skull bones. When you look at those and you work with each other on those things, make sure, and you have a pen, you point, make sure you use the back end to point. Don't use let me draw it to point. We don't want to draw it to point. Because it's a pain to undraw it. It's like graffiti. We don't want to do that. And these things are much more expensive than they ever want to know they are, unfortunately. All right, so make sure when you point, which I encourage you to do that. Talk to each other about the models and so forth. But use the back of the pen to point.
Are these real or artificial?
No, these are plastic. Yeah, don't worry, you can touch those, it's plastic.
Oh my God.
You don't need to have weird dreams over these things. No, these are plastic models, and they're okay. So when you look at one of those skulls, and see, look at that, I even have exploded skulls. It's also plastic. They can color these. You see there is these jagged lines here that separate these bones. Here is all together, but you still see these jagged lines. And so when you look at the skull, you actually feel like you think it's one bone, but it's actually more than one bone. It's multiple bones. And the jagged lines are joints, like your finger joint, just not as flexible. But there's still connections between bones and bones, and we call that joints. A connection between a bone and a bone is considered a joint. And we'll talk about different joints a little bit later on. There's like the rib joints that are like weird because they don't move much, but they move a little bit. But these here also. So what they do is they separate the bones of the skull, and then we can name those different bones. So here we have an exploded skull where these things are separated. Let me make sure this doesn't fall down.
So when babies are small, they have a soft spot. So is that when it's closed and now it's just considered a bone?
Yeah, can you get the back there, the clavinet, that little baby skull? Could you get me one of those, please? I know that thing came up one day too, the soft spot. So when we look at these bones, the first bone we look at is the one in the front of the forehead. And that's, thank you so much. And that's known as the frontal bone. It's like, you can remember how that looks. You walk into the wall, it's the front of the head walks in the wall. So that's the frontal bone. So at least they had some sense of how to do that. And so that's right here, that's this bone. And then we go back from there, we have on the two sides, we have what's called the parietal bone. There's two of those, parietal bones. You see that on the list?
Yeah.
Good. So you want to know that. I say, what's this bone called? You say, it's called the parietal bone. And so when you look at soft spots, before babies are born in the womb, these skull plates are not really that jaggedly connected with each other that firmly. They're more soft, they're more smooth. And the bones are not fully formed. Like the frontal bone is two bones at that point. It's not just one bone. And so what happens when we get to the birth canal, the bones can squeeze underneath one another. For example, actually, most of these joints here, these sutures are jagged. But this one here on the side is actually overlaying one another. So it can squeeze, the skull can squeeze together when it gets to the birth canal. When the baby's born, the skull is not fully formed because it had to be able to squeeze to be born. And so that's where the soft spot happens, where these bones here are not fully formed. So between the sutures, there is some areas where there's just a membrane. No bone yet, just a membrane. And underneath there's the brain. So don't poke it. That's what they say, right? Well, we at least make sure that that's no guy, So don't poke it right here. So we also have one back here. So if you take these bones, so you have the frontal bone here, the parietal bones here, and then in the back you have this occipital bone, like back here. And you have another soft spot right here between the parietal bones and the occipital. So you've got one in the front, one in the back. They call that the Fontanelles when the baby's born. I might be in the text on canvas, but it's for sure in the textbook. So these are the soft spots. But that way we just learned all these bones right here, okay? And then we have a couple more bones that we need to know for the skull, big ones. We have frontal, parietal, occipital, and I look at that further down the list, it says temporal. Right here, temporal. And the temporal bone is where the ear is. So it's right behind the ear. So on here, you have the frontal bone, the parietal bone, and the temporal bone. I should leave this up. And so then what we do when we look at those bones, these are the main ones for the skull. We got a few smaller ones. We'll talk about those. But when you look at those bones, you got things on those bones. You got like things sticking out, or poking, or coming out, or weird moving things. We have to label those. And so we got landmarks on bones. So when you look at the list, you got a frontal bone, and underneath there you got a couple of landmarks. You said supraciliary arches. And the superciliary arches are actually the bony part of your eyebrow. So that's where your eyebrows are behind. So if you look at the bone here, you have your skull. Right here, that's a superciliary arch, the eyebrow part. So you want to know that. So it's kind of interesting that there's actually a bony part that goes to the eyebrows. I didn't know that first. But if you actually touch it, it's a little ridgy. You feel that. This is anatomy. It's your own body. You got to feel it. And then if you go between the eyebrows, we got this soft spot right here. And this is called the glabella. And that's also on the list. The soft spot is the glabella. Let's see if I have a picture that shows it right here. You can see right here, you got the frontal bone, then you got the superciliary arches, and then you got the glabella. And so then, when we go to the lab, after I talk to you, of course you want it now, but after I talk to you, I'll give you these pictures. And then on those pictures, you label the term one time, or you make it where it is on the skull. All right? So that's your homework to do for this stuff. Then you color it. You say like, oh look, this is called the glabella, and you color it glabella right here, or superciliary arch, you color it superciliary arch. So that's your homework. And then as we go further down, we review this stuff over and over, and then as we get to the test, I'm going to point to it on the test and say, like, what is this called? And you look at your list, because you can use that on the test, and you say, like, oh, this is called the glabella, and you write it down, glabella. And actually, it's always my first question, so my test, if people pay attention. Okay. So that's how the testing goes. But that's how you study for it. So you go down the list over and over and over, and that's how you get to memorize this material slowly and again. Okay, so when we go down here, we go from the frontal bone to the parietal bone, and on the parietal bone you see this thing called sagittal suture. And the sagittal suture is this jagged line on top here that you see that goes wiggly from side to side. It's what separates those two bones. That's the sagittal suture. I don't think I have a picture of it. That's the sagittal suture. And then from there, so that's the only thing I want you to know, the parietal bone. So if I say on a test, it says like, what's this landmark called? And I point to this suture, you say sagittal suture. If I say, what is this bone called? You say parietal bone. We'll get to that. I'll just repeat it over and over. It's not going to be complicated at the end. I just want to make sure. All you need to know for the test are going to be these terms. So make sure of that, okay? People freak out about tests and stuff. I do too. I took an anatomy course a couple of years ago. I freaked out about the test. And I should know this stuff. I don't remember. After we finish this material. Like in October. At some point in October. I'm still actually working on that date. I think I'm pushing it a week back. So we'll work on it. Yeah, we'll work on it. So when we get from the parietal bone, we go back and get to the occipital bone. So that's the back of the head. So that stuff, when you think about it, come on in. Have a seat, and I'm not sure if I'm sure there's handouts around. Here, take one of these. absolutely. There is, the occipital bone is kind of sturdy because when we're just born and walk around trying to walk, we always fall on that back, so it's got to be a bit sturdy. So we've got a few bumps here. So if you feel in the back of the head, if your head, you feel like a big bump. Feel that big bump? Yeah. Mine is big. I don't know. Some people have less than me. That's this big bump here. Can you see it on the skull? Can you feel it on the skull? Touch the skull. Part of why we're doing these classes like that is so we can actually feel these things. We do the kinesthetic learning that way. And that bump is known as the external occipital protuberance. Can you see that on the list? You feel that? External occipital protuberance. That's a freaking long letter, isn't that? And on a test, you can actually, we often, when the names are that long, we often have abbreviations. We call that the EOP. EOP. So that bump in the back of the head. And when you see a bump on bones, it's very often a muscle attachment. So bone growing out a little bit, it creates a muscle attachment. The muscle goes into the bone and pulls on it. And so the muscle that goes up here is actually known as the trapezius muscle. That if you've seen a muscle person from the back, you've seen a muscle that goes from here up there, down there, and then back up. That big flat one, that's that muscle. And it anchors right into here on the top. So that's the EOP. So that's a cool plate. You got that?
Yes, that's it. So
good.
See, that's the beginning of it.
Then let's see what else we got on that occipital bone. We got the foramen magnum. So when we look at the skull from below, we got a big hole in the middle. That big hole is a foramen. If you look at anatomy terms, one of the things you have commonalities coming up. But one thing that's common is the term foramen. The term foramen means hole. The term foramen means hole. So one thing that I think is great, actually, that I got as a student was a prefix and a suffix booklet. At this point, I would just print out lists from Google or something. But words that come back that are like meaning something. And the word foramen means hole. All right, foramen magnum. Magnum is big, right? A magnum is a big thing. So this is the big hole. Foramen magnum is the big hole. So I want you to know that term. And what do you expect to go through here? Any ideas? Anybody? The spinal cord. The spinal cord goes through here. So actually the brain stem almost goes here too. So the brain comes out of here, and then it goes down through the spine, and it feeds the whole body with nerve energy, which is this energy that makes us sure we don't fall down kind of stuff, right? That's nerve energy. So that's the foramen magnum. And then next to the foramen magnum, we have these soft sort of cave surfaces, like going a little forward towards the jaw. You see those? Those are joint surfaces. You see, feel how soft they are when you touch them? They're like, there's very soft right here. And so they make a connection with another bone. And so these here connect actually with the first vertebra of the spinal cord right here. And so right here. And sort of what that becomes, it becomes sort of the, there's a wobbly head up here. So those are the occipital condyles. And condyles is a term that we use for things that make joints. Condyle makes joints. So that's a good term to know. We got them in the knee, for example. They use that term a lot in the knee. All right? We'll get to that later on. Walk around.
Mm-hmm. That's a hard one to get.
The condyles are hard. See these here? Those soft things next to that's where like it's a wobble head. Like, in the car, like that kind of. That's to balance. The skull has to balance on the spine on these. Yeah, we should. You see it? Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. All right, so yeah, that's good. That's good. We'll bring the vertebra out next. You guys found it? Yeah, look here. Go turn it around and see these surfaces right here. That's where that's then the connection to the spine right there. So those are the occipital condyles. Yes, sir.
Can you show us?
Oh, absolutely. They're right these here. So you see them right here. You see them like they're bulkier bone. So you can sort of see how they can hold the skull up, like they don't collapse, right? You know, you got to think practical about it. It's like engineering. It's like you're building a house. Kind of thing, yeah. Yeah, you could totally take pictures of any of these things. Absolutely. When we go to Cadaver, we can't do the picture. That's the only place. But these, absolutely, yeah. Take pictures. You can. We are actually trying to make a video. You can take video. You can tell me, go through them. We do up this. It's totally cool. I'm a visual learner too, believe me. I try to learn auditorily. I fall asleep all the time. Anyway, so we have the foramen magnum, the occipital condyles, the external, the big bump on the head, the external EOP thing, and now we get to the temporal bone. The temporal bone is the bone behind the ear. So on this skull here, it's the orange one. So that's like really goofy looking. So that's like the ear canal thing. And so if you look at the ear, you've got the ear canal from the outside. So that's one of the terms. That's the external acoustic meatus. See that term? External acoustic meatus. That's the external ear canal. So that's literally that hole you're sticking that's literally your ear hole thing. Where you stick, where you stick a finger in. Oh, you shouldn't. You tell your kid not to.
Where?
Right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's literally that hole that goes then in where the sound waves go into the ear, and then you actually hear. So that's kind of cool stuff. You guys see it? Yeah, there you go. It's the physical. You guys need more than one skull. Oh wait, we have not more than one skull.
Here we go.
Oh, there we go. We have an extra. You guys need to feel this stuff. This is a touching. You guys, thank you so much. This is a kinesthetic class. Most of us learn by doing it kind of that way. So that's the external acoustic meatus. Now that's where we hear. So the sound waves come here, they go in here. And then if you open the skull up, let's open the skull up. Can you open the skull up? So you have these little things, you open it. And then in here, if you look inside, you see behind that ear there is these ridges on the inside. You see that? This is the petrous portion. And it's on your list under the temporal bone. The petrous portion.
Where is it?
It's right in here. Yeah, that ridge. You see that ridge? That's that. And you know, in there is all that. When we hear, that's what's happening in there. So the sound waves go from the outside here down inward. And then inside that petrous portion is where we have the apparatus that makes sound waves into nerve energy that we can hear. Right here, that bump, that ridge, this one. Oh, yeah, that one. You see it? That's where the sound waves come in. And then in here is the hearing apparatus. So the petrous portion is where we have the hearing apparatus in. That's right in it. So that's cool. We're going to pick that up when we talk about hearing later on in the semester. But to me, that's pretty remarkable. That little thing in here is where we hear. If that don't work, we can't hear. That's pretty crazy. But, you know, that's how the body goes. It's pretty cool stuff. And then we're going to go back to the outside. And what I want you to do on your own head, behind your ear is a bump. You feel that bump? Press it a little bit. Don't press too hard, but press a little bit. It's a little tender. You feel that? This bump is right here. That bump is known as the mastoid process. The bump behind the ear. The bump behind the ear. And that's a specific bone that's sort of a little bubbly. And that's why when you squeeze it, it's a little sensitive. Mastoid process. The bump behind the back of the ear. No, the bump behind the ear. The bump behind the ear. Masculine process, the bump behind the ear. The masculine process, the bump behind the ear. There you go. You got that? Then from there, we, on those skulls, these are plastic skulls. So from there, if you go a little forward, you got this little thing sticking down. Like, what the heck is that? On the real skulls, this is broken off because it's so skinny. But on the plastics, we can keep it. This is called a styloid process. That little thing sticking out. That's like, you know, a stylus that you use on a phone or on the tablet or something like that. It means pen. So styloid process means pen, if we translate it from Latin. So these, anything that sticks out like that is a bumpy kind of thing. First thing I think of is a muscle attachment. So these here, the styloid process, the muscles that we use to swallow, that bring this bone here in the front, the hyoid bone up and down, they're attached to this styloid process. So that's what we use that for. So that's kind of an interesting place. Temporalis portion, Acoustic Meatus, Mandibular Fossa, Mandibular Process. So then the last thing that we haven't touched yet is once we go forward to the facial bones, to the jaw bones, which we'll do in a little bit, we got to attach this lower jawbone somehow to the skull. We got to make a joint. Again, a joint is a bone-to-bone connection. And so what we do is we have this groove here on the temporal bone, and that groove is known as the mandibular fossa. This bone here is known as the mandible as a bone, the mandible. A fossa is sort of a shallow depression that we can make a joint with, that like something can fit into a fossa. So a mandibular fossa is right here. Whoops, if you look at your skull, it's the soft plastic part that makes this indentation that the lower jawbone can fit into. So that's the mandibular fossa. So you see that? It's the soft plastic. You see that here? That soft plastic part? That's that groove here. That is the mandibular fossa. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah, this part here, this part, this soft plastic, this like, you know, yeah, that one, it looks like a cartilage by its own self, you know. You got it? This one here? That's the mandibular fossa. Yeah, but I'll get on that. Make sure, yeah, you're onto the temporal bone, right? You have the mandibular fossa under the temporal bone. This plastic here, that's that fossa that makes that groove that this bone can fit into. So we need to give that a name, right? So that's a mandibular fossa. So whenever you see the term fossa, you're thinking joint, you're thinking bone-to-bone connection, you're thinking sort of a shallow groove kind of thing. All right. That make sense? So far, so good? Make sure you ask questions, okay? Because then from there, I think we got figured out the temporal bone, and then we got two kind of internal bones in the skull, and one of them is the sphenoid bone, and the other one is called the ethmoid bone. Do you have that one? Yeah, you got one of those over here. Do you have one of those? Not yet. You got one of those here, you got one of those here, and you don't have one of those? Yeah, you got one of those. Oh, yes, it's Anyway. So what I just gave you is a cutout of a bone that here you can see is the yellow bone that goes across. It goes across the skull like that, underneath. So you can't really see it easily from the outside. So you have to see it sort of from the inside. So when we take the skull plate off on top on a regular skull, it sort of sits inside here, actually this way, like inside here, and goes across. Okay, so it sits inside here and goes across. So it's an interesting looking bone. So part of the bone, these parts here, are the back of the roof of the mouth. It comes down, like if you reach your tongue all the way back, you might be touching this thing. And then on top here is where the brain sits in. So we've got all these weird parts to it. Looks really like, they call it, looks like a bat. So Sphenoid Bone, that's a Sphenoid Bone, I should have said that. That's a Sphenoid Bone. That looks like they call that a bat-shaped bone. I don't know, it looks like flubbery bat bone. A little bit, right? Yeah.
Butterfly.
Butterfly. Yeah, no, other people say butterfly, you know. If you ever want to understand the German language really well, you know the word butterfly. You know, in Spanish, it's known as, what is it called? Mariposa? In what is it also called in Italian? No, in French it's called papillon. You know, very nice word. In English it's called butterfly. In German, Schmetterling. The thing I can smash. You know, I'm German, so I can joke about the Germans. So they should. It's always like, really? They have to come up with ever for something like that delicate? Anyway, when you look at that sphenoid bone, what's very interesting, clinically speaking, is that every other bone that we talked about so far attaches to that bone. So if you have a concussion, that bone becomes sort of they call it a keystone bone, like everything attaches to it. But when we look at the parts to it that I'm most interested in it, is that little thing there in the middle. And so when you put that piece down and you take your regular skull back up, if you look in the middle of the inside of the skull, you've got that indentation there. And that indentation is known as the Cellar Torsica. And that's on the sphenoid bone. And Cellar Torsica means actually Turkish saddle. So a Turkish saddle sort of resembles this sort of look, with the four pieces going up, I think, on each side.
Do you have a slide?
Let me see if I have a slide. Yeah, I do. Excellent. Thank you. So when we look at the skull from the inside, here's the front, here's the back. Here's that crossbone, that's that sphenoid bone, that red bone here. And the one part I want you to know is that inside portion here, that Cellar Torsica. What it means is Turkish saddle.
What is it?
It's a very good question. That's very important. What it holds is the pituitary gland. Now, we just talked about glandular tissue, I think, last week or something. And glands are like a lot of cells together. They grow a lot. They make a lot of produce, sweat glands. They produce a lot of sweat. Every gland produces a lot of these secretions. Brain tissue is very slow growing and it's very soft. And so we have this gland that sits in the middle of the darn brain that can grow a lot out of hand and push into the brain. How are we going to contain it? We make bone around it. And so that's why they make this big, deep bone indentation that they close that gland inside bone that it can't push out against the brain tissue. So that's really a very good question. And the reason why we have that gland right there is because the brain and the body are very closely related. The brain needs to coordinate what's going on in the body. And some of that is like reaction time. Like that's like the brain, we think about nerve energy. But other things are like slower processes, like, hormone balance and things like that. And that happens right there in that Cellar Torsica, okay, in that space. That hormonal balance, that place where the brain controls sort of body hormone function. So that's very interesting. That's a very good question. Cellar Torsica, and it's really a cool name. Isn't that a cool name? I mean, some of these names, you got to step back and go like, what the heck were they thinking coming up with these names? You just got to have a little appreciation for that part. And anatomy is a lot of picture book, right? You need to step back and think about it like, what the heck? Like the next one, this is the ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid bone is a gnarly little thing. It's like the inside of the nose bone. It's like if you squeeze your nose in, if you take the top layer off, what you see afterwards, the nostrils and all that, that's ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid bone sticks up into the front part of the brain right here. Like if this is holding like that, that's the front. Like this piece here coming up, that's ethmoid bone. Sticking into the frontal bone, like poking up. And that portion there is known as the crista galli. And that's on your list as well. And literally that means, you know, the chicken on the cocks, the cone. That's what that means. It's like that thing on top. Crista galli. And that actually becomes some attachment for a membrane that then separates the brain from left to right when you later on go to the brain. So that's where that comes in. But what's also interesting about this is, see next to it, there's this plate, there's all these holes in here. See all these holes? This, you can see it on your thing too, it's just not, it's plastic, so it's a little bit, not really going all the way through. But these holes go all the way to the upper nose. And they have the nerves that smell go down and bring smell going into the brain that way. So the smell nerves go through this plate. It's known as the cribriform plate. The smell nerves go through this plate into the brain. I think that's pretty cool. It's true. We don't have a real skull. If you have a real skull, you really see them going all the way through. You know, they're really small little tiny nerves. I know, there's your smelling. Thank the Lord we can smell. I know. So that's what I want you to know about the ethmoid bone. The bone behind the nose. And then from there, we get to a few bones that make up the face. The part here. So that the skull bones hold the brain, and the facial bones sort of make up the face. Although they kind of go, you know, the frontal bone is like those kind of thing. And when we look at those, we have a few that we outline. We have the maxilla. The big ones are the maxilla, the mandible, the zygomatic, and the nasal. Although the nasal is not that big one. But the ones that I want to point out for sure is the maxilla, because that's where the upper teeth are sitting in. So the bone right here under the nose, that's the maxilla bone. All right, on there is the purple bone. Purple is my favorite bone. Uh-oh. Maybe on the test. Here's a maxilla right here, where the upper teeth are. Upper jawbone. And then the lower jawbone is here. That's the mandible. That's the mandible, the one that moves. The maxilla doesn't move. The mandible moves. So that's the teeth. And we want to get those together. All right. On the maxilla, we have a landmark that I do want you to know, and that landmark, if we turn this upside down, let's see if we can do that. Yeah, look at that, we can. Is known as the Palatine Process. So the roof of your mouth, that's the roof of your mouth. You stick your tongue up, that's what you touch. It's the Palatine Process on the maxilla. On your skulls and on the list, you also have the word that says Palatine Bone. Do you see that? And if you take the roof of the mouth back further, and almost, these are actually these things from the sphenoid that come down, but if you go back to the roof of the mouth, to the end of it, if you probably can't reach the tongue, then you reach the Palatine Bone. So that's a bone on its own. So I want you to also know that. I don't know, I was probably really mean when I made that list, that I put that out. But the other thing I just want you to appreciate, you know, in your skull, you see that line on the roof of the mouth? That's the process, and behind there is the bone. You know. Process and bone. Palatine process and palatine bone. It's just, palatine process is important. You've got to push that food up there before you swallow it. If you don't have a palatine process, oh, this is an old story. Like there was, you know, the French, they used to have a king too, not just the British. And Louis XIII was called the Sun King. That's the guy who made Versailles outside of Paris, that big old castle. But back when, that was like that was before Napoleon. That was like a long time ago. And I read a medical report once. And they used these kings to like try new medical techniques out. And for some reason, this king was a total shorty and whatever was wrong with him, but he had like a problem with swallowing and breathing, and they thought, oh, we can improve his breathing by taking this piece away. So they took this piece out. So, then he go eating and everything come out of his nose. So, thank God we're not kings. Just telling you. Anyway, but that was like crazy. But that was like when I learned about this Palatine process, like now I know why it's formed. That's how you kind of learn about these kind of things. So that was pretty funny. So we have the Palatine process, Palatine bone, and then we get into the mandible. The mandible is the jawbone, lower jawbone. We have a few parts there that we need to know. One is the front of the jawbone. If you run into the wall this way, you hit that, and that's the body of the mandible. The body of the mandible. Yeah, it doesn't show it here, but it shows it here. See the body of the mandible down here. So that's sort of the front piece, the main piece. And then we got the side part here, and that's known as the ramus, or mandibular ramus. And that's another piece that I want you to know about that. So that's this piece right here. And then when you go further up, you have this one part of the bone that goes into the temporal bone, into that mandibular fossa that we were just talking about on the temporal bone. And that's known as the mandibular condyle. And again, you see the word condyle? We had occipital condyle already. Mandibular condyle, you always think a joint. You see condyle, you think some other bone is attaching to that thing. That's a joint. And again, the knee is the big one where we've got to call back. Mandibular condyle. So condyle is one of those words that you want to know. And if somebody can spearhead a list, maybe we can make a list of these terms. I always forget. I always mean to do it. And then another term that we have on this one is when you move forward a little, you cannot see it quite, but they're hidden behind here. It's this little thing that sticks up. And that's the coronoid process. That little thing that sticks up. So it's in front of the mandibular condyle, coronoid process. That's what it is. Coronoid process. And whenever you see a process, the first thing you think, muscle attachment. Whenever something sticks out in the bone, you think first thing, muscle attachment. Everything else, you need an explanation for it. That's kind of how you're going to look at that stuff. And the muscle that attaches on the coronoid process is one of the chewing muscles. You guys got it? Good. And which we're going to do soon next. But when we look at the chewing muscles, we need to close that jaw. And we got one big chewing muscle that comes up here and attaches on the ramus and goes right to this bone area here. And that bone here is the cheekbone, and that's the last bone. No, not quite the last, but almost the last bone. That's the zygomatic bone. The cheekbone is the zygomatic bone. And one of those jaw muscles that close the jaw is attached on the ramus, and then on part of that zygomatic bone, it pulls that jaw closed, like it pulls it. Muscle tissue does one thing, it shortens. So if you look at most muscles are attached to bones. So like your biceps, they're like, the one I used to see, this one. That one is attached to a bone here and up here. And all it does, it shortens and then it brings the bones closer to one another. So that's all muscle does. And then the difficulty with muscle is just where do they attach? They're all over the place. And then you got to figure out with like the stick figure person, how did they move and they contract there and there and there. And then you start understanding all the muscle function from that kind of perspective. And so when you have a muscle that attaches here on the ramus and up here, and it just shortens when it's like that, it's just going to close that jaw down. So that's what it does. That's its jaw. It's one jaw. Then you got another one, and that's where the coronoid process comes in. The coronoid process has a muscle attachment that goes from here up into the head on top of your ear. So if you close your teeth down, clench your teeth and put your finger up here above the head, you feel that muscle bulging. That's a second very important muscle that closes the jaw. And that's attached there. So we're going to name that muscle in a moment when we do that. That makes sense a little bit? Yeah? Yeah, good. And then the last one that we want to do is the nasal bone. Guess what the nasal bone is? On the nose. So that's another reason why I put the nasal bone down there. Is when I learn anatomy and physio and all this science weird stuff, whatever makes sense, I don't have to study that hard. So I always first check off, does this make sense or is this something that don't make sense? So if it makes sense, it's like, let me just leave it alone and keep making it sense, you know? So I don't have to study too hard. So the nasal bone is right on top of the nose. See that? Right on top of the nose. Excellent. All right, you guys got any questions to those terms so far? Pretty okay? A little overwhelmed? Yeah, a little bit? Well, that's good. You want to be a little overwhelmed. This is class. You've got to learn some stuff, right? So what I want you to do now is I want you to go to the tables and with your, well, first, introduce yourselves, like better than what I did. Oh, I didn't introduce you, but I even didn't introduce myself either.
I am totally aware of that.
Oh, you are? I did the
Yes.
same on Monday. It's been so overwhelming to come back to the classroom. I'm your teacher.
Wow.
And I've been doing this class for, I don't know, a whole bunch of years, 10 years or more than that. And I've been studying chiropractic before that, in the late 90s, and then massage before that. And anyway, it's a long time ago. But so I both teach anatomy. I'm Christoph Muellinghaus is my name. They call me Dr. M over here. And I teach anatomy, but I also work as a chiropractor, body worker in Oakland, and do that kind of work. And so that's why muscle bones are sort of my topic of thing. But that's sort of, I can bring in a little bit of experience from my real world at least, you know, about how the patient work goes and all that, and try to share a little bit of that. But I've been doing this for quite some time and, you know, been enjoying it a lot. So anyway, do that with each other, talk to each other and say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and share what you like to do. What are you going for? You know, what do you do when you grow up in this educational field? Then after that, go through these terms that we just talk to each other, and I will hand out some paper that you can start labeling on the paper, and I'll walk around, and I can answer questions. Sonia also can walk around a little, and then, no, Sonia actually is over here, and if you have any questions for her, she can also answer questions during this time. Okay? We already talked about muscles contract. So one thing they do is shorten. That's all they do. When we talk about muscle tissue, we learn how they do that on a microscopic level. But when we talk about the muscles in the body, all we need to really know is they shorten. So if you have a muscle in the skeletal system, it's always attached on a bone and on another bone. So the front of the arm muscle is attached to bone here, to bone here. If it shortens, it brings the forearm up. That's what its function then will be, what it does. So that's really all it does. And then it can let go of that shortening, but it cannot lengthen actively. It has to let go. So another muscle will have to contract to make it go back out, so the arm is straight again. So we'll talk about those kind of relationships. So that's kind of interesting. And really everything is kind of built that way. In the face, we have muscles, most of the muscles attached to skin, not to bone. All right, some are attached from bone to bone. The last ones we go through, those are the chewing muscles. They have to close the jaw. That's a bone-to-bone attachment. You've got to move bone around. But a lot of them are here for facial expressions. We smile, we frown, we do those things. We move skin around to express our emotions or express what we feel. And so a lot of the facial muscles do that. So for our knowledge, we go through a few of them, or the major ones of them. There's many more, of course. There's always many more. But don't worry about that. But what I want you to do is, as we go through, if you look at the list, the third column in the middle that says muscle, that first batch there is the facial muscles. And what I want you to do is, when we look at those, we look at some muscle naming. And muscles are often named. Because one of the things with anatomy is like, you see all these weird terms, you go like, oh my God, how am I going to figure all that out? But they actually, most of them make some kind of sense. And in muscle, the sensibility is often about the naming goes by where the muscles attach, or the naming goes by what function the muscle does. So, like here, if you look at that list, you got like this says depressor anguli oris, so depressor labii inferior. It's like, oh my God, depressor means pulling something down. So right there, you know, this muscle is going to have to pull something down. So that's a function. Or you have the word levator, or what is it? Yeah, levator, labii superior. You know, that lifts something up. So that's a good way of naming muscles. And so as we go through the muscles, or in other ways, like you see that muscle called nasalis, guess where that muscle is? Around the nose somewhere, right? The name is nose. So geographic, you know, that's where also it comes up that the first chapter I made you study, you know, what is this called? What is this called? What is this? Like, what the heck am I supposed to know all of that? But when you then look at muscles, for example, this is the brachium. We call that the brachium. You've got like multiple muscles that all have the word brachii of some kind in it. So you just read the muscle name and you see that word, you're like, oh, it's got to be the old somewhere. Even if you don't know the detail yet, then you look it up. So that's sort of how we learn anatomy terminology. Like we're creating a spider web of terms that then can hang and we can make sense of it. So that's, and in a muscle, you don't want to just memorize. You want to make sense of them. That's one reason why I make it open book tests. You can look it up. I want you to organize your material. I don't want you to just memorize blindly. All right, so let's go through some of those. So the first muscle we got is the Frontalis Muscle. Well, guess what? That's right on top of the frontal bone. So that's pretty neat, as the name goes. And the front is, you know, if you run into the wall with your head first, you run into the front first. So that's how you remember that name. Frontalis Muscle. Then, doesn't show on this model well. Nowhere on that. Course. The second one I want you to know is the Corrugator Superciliary muscle. And that muscle I want you to know is because it's right here over the glabella and it makes you frown and be angry. It's the angry muscle. Corrugator Superciliary. Supposed to take that top off and it shows it up there. Corrugator Superciliary. That's the muscle. If you have too many lines up here and you look too angry all the time, they're going to squirt Botox in that thing. And then it's paralyzed. You can't contract anymore. No, did you ever ask, where did the anger go? The anger's still there. Huh. Danger. All right, you have a question?
Well, it's not here.
No, it's not there. I'm going to give you that sheet afterwards. Otherwise, everybody's just taking only notes on that thing. And so that's the corrugator superciliary. Then we got two muscles. If you see there, two muscles that have the term orbicularis in them. One is orbicularis oculi, and one is orbicularis oris. Orb is a round thing. Orb, the globe. So orbicularis is a round muscle. So one is around the eye. Orbicularis oculi, and one is around the mouth, orbicularis oris. Oris is the mouth. We can go back to that thing. So they're indicated there. I'll leave that one. So that's the two orbicularis muscles, oculi and oris. And then when you look at the mouth needs to do a whole bunch of different functions. It's got to smile, it's got to frown, it's got to talk, all kind of stuff. And so we got a bunch of muscles that do things. So we got muscles that, two sets of muscles, one pulls the corner of the mouth up, and one pulls it down. And then we got another set of muscles of one pulls the lip up and one pulls the lip down. And so when we look at those muscles, the one that pulls the lip up, no, let's start with the one that pulls the corner of the mouth up. That muscle is known as the zygomaticus. And remember we just talked about the cheekbone? That's the zygomatic bone, the cheekbone. And the zygomatic muscle goes from there into the corner of the mouth and pulls that corner of the mouth up and makes us smile. So that's the smiling muscle. Zygomaticus makes us smile. And then we got one on the other side. So the zygomatic goes up to the cheekbone. And then we got one here that brings the corner of the mouth down. And that one is called the depressor. We'll bring it down. Anguli, corner, like means angle, or you could interpret that as, or depressor anguli oris. Or no, inferioris, right? No, depressor anguli oris. That's the muscle that then brings the corner of the mouth downward. So we have one that brings the lip up, so we can smile, one that brings the corner of the mouth down, so we can frown. So we have an ability, array of emotions we can express. And then we got one that says here, levator labii superioris, and one that says depressor labii inferioris. You see those? The depressor labii inferioris, if you look at the mouth here, you see the corner of the mouth muscle brings it down to about here. And then right next to it, we got one muscle that sort of goes to the lip and brings it laterally a little bit towards the outside. That's that muscle there. It's a little hard to see. See here we got the depressor labii, the depressor anguli. So that muscle goes to the corner of the mouth and pulls it down. And then one next to it that goes into the lip pulls the lip down more. Pout. It's the pouting muscle. When I don't like something kind of muscle. That's the depressor labii inferioris muscle. And then the equivalent to below here, the depressor labii inferioris, we have a levator labii superioris. You see that on our list? So we got one that brings the lip down, depressor brings it down, levator brings it up. And the levator labii superioris is a deep muscle in here that is very difficult to see on the model here. But guess what? It's not on the test sheet. But you can see it goes right into here, deep into underneath it, into the lip, and pulls that lip up. So the zygomatic is the corner, and then the depressor labii, the levator labii is on the one next to it. So you see it on this picture here. It's right here, levator labii. So it's right in here. So it brings the lip, more or less the lip up. And a lot of times, these muscles, it's a little ambiguous because it's anatomy. Everybody's a little bit different. So one of the things I'm also looking is from where to where does it go? What does it do? And then I can sort of make up. So this muscle doesn't show well on the model. Shows better on here. But then I'll give you the handouts. And we'll look at where it shows on there, okay? All right, so then what else we got? Nasalis. Again, where would that be? On the nose. So you got a muscle right on top of the nose. That's the nasalis muscle. Muscle right on top of the nose is the nasalis muscle. And then when we look again on the cheek, or the mouth, next to the mouth is the cheek. And deep in the cheek, on the inside, deep on it, is a muscle known as the buccinator. Buccinator. That's on the list. Buccinator. Buccinator.
Can you identify with the number?
Oh, number?
Yeah, that number.
37. Sometimes they're different.
Oh.
And that muscle In an infant, that muscle in an infant is very, very thick. And it makes the mouth feel like a really good vacuum cleaner. So it compresses from the outside in, so it can really do good sucking. So that's what that also does. The buccinator is very big in a Louis Armstrong and trumpet people. Or the dimple, you see dimples? Dimple muscle. Makes dimple. And then on top of that buccinator, we have a sliver of muscle that goes from the corner of the mouth straight backwards. And that is the rhizorius. You see that on your list? Rhizorius. Rhizorius. Right here, rhizorius. And the deep one inside here is the buccinator. So the sliver like tenses the mouth, it makes it tight to the outside. The buccinator is deep and makes that sucking motion. So it's very, very developed in babies. Less so in us. And then what we have left here on that list is two muscles. One is the masseter, one is the temporalis. We already talked about those. Those are the two muscles that close the jaw. We have four altogether. We studied two of them. So we have two on the outside. We studied those. And we got the one that's right on the ramus of the mandible, goes up right into the cheekbone, into the zygomatic area, and closes the jaw this way. Just pulls it closed. So that's the masseter. And you can see that here, masseter is right here. You see that right here. Right here, masseter. And then the second one we have is from the coronoid process. That process here that sticks up, that weird little thing. I was like, why the heck is that there? And it goes from here and it reaches all the way up to above the ear. And it's like a muscle that closes the jaw from this angle. So you have the masseter that closes the jaw this angle, and then the temporalis. That muscle is called the temporalis muscle because it's right where the temporal bone is. Right? So the terminology again, try to make sense of what they're trying to say, right? Temporal, when you know temporal bone, you know temporalis muscle, right there, it's the same thing. So that goes right here and it goes down and closes the jaw this angle. And you can feel this muscle if you close your mouth and clench your teeth and you hold your fingers here above the ears, it clenches, it bunches up. On this model, it's pretty small. On this model, it's pretty small. But it's the same. And again, anatomy is individual. So a little bit of that we unfortunately have to eat up. All right, I think that's all on the list. Do you guys have any questions to those? Or you want to go through them a little bit? Let's do it.